Do you work for Donald Trump? Yes or no?
If I'm permitted to say, we're an independent central bank. We're honored to be independent. Our independence came from you.
On July 14th, 2026, House Financial Services held Kevin Warsh's first appearance before Congress as Federal Reserve Chair. A day later, he gave the same semi-annual report to the Senate. The policy backdrop is unusually sharp and immediate. The Fed's July report said inflation remained above its 2% goal, while the federal funds target had stayed at 3.5% to 3.75%. But the argument in this room wasn't only about rates, it was about who gets to influence them. Democrats questioned whether Warsh could resist President Trump. Republicans pressed him to own the inflation problem and keep the central bank inside its mandate. The question running through the hearing was simple: independent judgment or White House pressure?
Turning to the Federal Reserve, Trump has repeatedly attacked your predecessor, Chairman Jerome Powell, because he refused to kiss the ring and bend monetary policy to the president's demands. His administration continues to try to remove your colleague, Governor Lisa Cook. I hope we hear from you today how exactly you will defend your colleagues and the Federal Reserve. You should also take no comfort in the Supreme Court's shielding the Fed when it overturned Humphrey's executor. The court vastly expanded presidential authority over independent agencies, and it is likely to still come for other functions of the Fed, like bank supervision next. Committed Democrats will continue fighting to protect the independence of the Fed and other agencies, strengthen consumer protections, and build on an economy that prioritizes working families, not the president, the wealthy or the well-connected. So I look forward to your testimony today. I yield back the balance of my time.
That was Maxine Waters' case, and it needs to be labeled accurately. It was the ranking Democrats' argument, not a neutral finding by the committee. The confirmed facts are narrower. Congress created the Fed with operational independence in monetary policy. Warsh had taken office as chair on May 22nd, and this hearing was his first House appearance in the job. Waters connected Trump's past criticism of Jerome Powell and the administration's fight with Governor Lisa Cook to a warning about political control. Warsh's opening statement answered from a different direction. He tied independence to accountability, then argued that the institution had to restore price stability and overhaul how it makes decisions.
It's a prudent and wisely conceived obligation designed to keep the Fed accountable, responsible, and faithful to its congressional mandate of full employment and price stability. These obligations are of a piece with the Fed's rightful independence in the conduct of monetary policy. Stepping back, I would say today as we sit here, Mr. Chairman, we're at a hinge point in history. It's up to all of us to meet this moment. The task for this generation of policymakers and of individuals and households in the private sector is to ensure that the American economy excels far into the future. Now, at the Fed, our number one objective is getting monetary policy right. That's our clear and constant aim, the star we steer by. And if we get policy right, and I can assure you we will, the inflation surge of the last 5 years will be a thing of the past. Just a month ago, I chaired my very first meeting of the FOMC. My colleagues and I recognize that high inflation has been an undue burden on American households and businesses. And while monthly price volatilities and variations are inevitable, especially in an unsettled world, underlying inflation over longer time horizons is determined largely by monetary policy. As the chairman said at the outset, inflation's a choice. The members of our committee have no tolerance for persistently elevated inflation, and we share a resolute commitment to ensure price stability. This was the focus of our June meeting, at which we decided to hold the target range in the Fed funds rate at 3.5% to 3.75%. Now, naturally, our work at the Fed demands a proper reading on economic conditions. As you see in our report, economic activity grew at a solid pace, showing remarkable resilience in the face of recent developments. Household consumption, moderate. Manufacturing output, it moved up steadily this past year. The housing sector, however, gives a somewhat different picture and continues to lag. I want to highlight the most striking feature of this economy right now, and it's business investment. The rapid pace, which appears to be accelerating, reflects in part the construction of data centers and other infrastructure, and the immense demand for AI-related equipment and software. Investment in equipment overall increased about 8% for the year in the first quarter. Within that category, high-tech spending logged an especially impressive growth rate of nearly 25%.
Warsh's defense mixed evidence with judgment. The evidence came from the Fed's own July report. Inflation had risen and remained above the 2% objective, while the labor market was broadly stable. His judgment was that the Fed could not outsource responsibility for persistent inflation. In the next exchange, Chairman French Hill tested that idea against shocks the central bank cannot control, including overseas conflict and supply pressure. Warsh did more than repeat a target. He said the Fed's 2020 framework had been a mistake, argued it had tolerated too much inflation, and promised not to blame someone else. That's a genuine change in institutional direction. It also creates the harder question: can a chair claim full ownership of prices while remaining insulated from a president who wants a different rate path?
As outlined in your statement, inflation is the result of many factors. Of these, the Fed has control only over one: monetary policy, as expressed through its interest rate and balance sheet policy. Today, a potential second surge of inflation is appearing due to factors outside the Fed's control. What the Fed can control is how it reacts. Though upward pressure on prices may diminish on its own, it's not a sure thing. The Fed may be able to look through these inflationary pressures, but the Fed has believed that before and has been wrong. High inflation affects Americans in the here and now, not in some hypothetical future composed of long-term projections or of inflation expectations. Mr. Chairman, I was very encouraged to hear both in your testimony and your opening FOMC statement about restoring price stability as a top priority for you. When we think about that in the near term, though, how do you and your colleagues on the Open Market Committee plan to accomplish that given the policy tools at your disposal?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We want economic growth to be more broad-based, and we want the change in prices, the increase in inflation, to be more limited. There are a lot of things that are happening that are outside of our control, as you mentioned, conflicts overseas and the rest. We can't have and shouldn't have a direct control on that. But inflation's a choice. We monetary policymakers need to choose lower prices, and that's the commitment my colleagues have made. In direct answer to your question, I would say we're doing three things. One, commitment, which you heard at our first FOMC meeting, and I hope you heard today, is we're committed to the Fed to deliver price stability. We're committed to the 2% inflation goal. And so for businesses or households or market participants who came into this saying, well, they said before they were committed, but they seem to have tolerated a higher level of inflation, that commitment is resolute. Second thing that we can do is take ownership. This isn't a time for us to pass the buck, to blame others. The Federal Reserve can and will deliver price stability. We have the tools that you mentioned, both interest rates and balance sheet policy, that can help us achieve that aim, and we have the tools to deliver that. So it's a function of commitment, responsibility, and tools, and we're 3 for 3, and we'll deliver.
Thank you. I referenced in my opening statement about the 2020 decision on tolerating higher inflation and that it's now been abandoned by the board. Clearly, I think that was a policy error. It was praised by some at the time in August of 2020, but I found it alarming at the time it took place. First of all, do you agree with the FOMC's decision to abandon that? And secondly, how do you consider this past 6 years of experience when you look at the task force work on the framework question for looking at inflation.
Yeah, so there's no secret that at the time that the framework in 2020 was announced, the new framework, which was intended to get inflation higher, that at the time and in subsequent years before finding my way into this job, I was very critical of it. That central bank wasn't the first central bank to ask for a little more inflation and end up with a lot more. It was a mistake. The framework did not succeed in its objectives, and I am pleased that before my arrival, that my predecessors took that and cast it aside. All central bankers are going to make some share of mistakes, but when they make a mistake, they've got to call it out. Had that mistake been called out sooner, I don't believe we would have been burdened with this undue tax over the last 5 years. It's nearly the same degree. That's why we are reform-oriented. That's why my colleagues and I are so driven by these task forces to think about them anew. And in final response, I'd just say one of the task forces you mentioned is to revisit the inflation frameworks that the Federal Reserve uses so that we can better understand what will cause inflation to rise and fall and what we can do about it.
Well, thank you. And you also referenced courage in your opening statement, and you've just outlined the toughness of the set of policy choices that you and your fellow governors have. So difficult that your longtime predecessor, Arthur Burns, described that mission as the anguish of central banking to try to cope with the different structures. So in the last seconds I have left, will your task force work review the issue of what you have control over versus what is in the control of the Congress and regulatory and executive branch authority?
Yeah, I'll be brief in my response given the time. There's no anguish in central banking here, Mr. Chairman. We have the commitment, the power, and the responsibility to deliver on the mandate that this committee gave us, and we will. We've got full ability to do it, so you will not hear me blaming anyone else.
Now the hearing moved from policy theory to a loyalty test. Representative Nydia Velazquez asked whether Warsh worked for Donald Trump, then immediately pressed him on what he would do if the president targeted him or other governors over interest rate votes. Her wording was adversarial. Warsh's answer was narrower. The Fed is an independent central bank. The courts had recognized that independence in monetary policy, and he would continue doing his job. He also promised to remove politics from inside the institution. That still left an accountability problem. Independence doesn't mean secrecy, and Velazquez challenged his plan to change Fed communications through task forces whose standards had not yet been made public. Listen for the line between resisting political pressure.
What steps would you take if the president or others in the administration target you or your fellow governors because he doesn't like how many of them are voting on interest rate policy?
So it's not my intuition to engage in hypotheticals, but I'll tell you this: the Supreme Court said
that's an easy way out.
The Supreme Court said that the Federal Reserve and the conduct of monetary policy is independent. To the extent there were questions about it, the courts answered those questions.
So what would you do?
I would continue to do my job.
Okay, good. Chair Warsh, do you agree that current monetary policy exists in an extremely polarized and politicized environment?
Outside the four walls of the Federal Reserve, there's no doubt a lot of politics. But my goal inside the central bank is for there to be no politics. To the extent there's politics there, we're going to get rid of them.
Well, I, along with many on my side, will say that the attempted firings of a sitting Fed governor and Fed chair in the central bank's 111-year history is quite the politicization and polarization of the Fed. Chair Warsh, at your nomination hearing a few months ago, you said, and I state, I am committed to ensuring that the conduct of monetary policy remains strictly independent. You just said that. Are you still committed to conducting independent monetary policy today?
Absolutely.
Given the current mistrust of government and the political environment surrounding your appointment, the decision to limit communications and offload Fed objectives to clandestine task forces with no clear transparency calls your motivations into question. Can you commit today to institute an explanatory framework that details the reasoning of the Fed's actions following policy changes?
I'm here today, Congressman, to do just that. And I think I've demonstrated in my first 6 or 7 weeks in office a commitment to independence and a commitment to reform. Those two are of common importance, and I'm going to deliver on both of them.
I'm glad to hear that.
Warsh had now said what the Fed is supposed to be. Gregory Meeks asked what happens when that principle becomes personally costly. His test was concrete. If President Trump publicly demands a course that conflicts with the economic data, which one wins? That question matters because rate decisions reach mortgages, credit cards, business investment, employment, and the value of the dollar. It also matters because the Fed's next policy meeting was scheduled for July 28 and 29. Meeks didn't ask Warsh to oppose the president on every issue. He asked for a decision rule. Warsh's answer was to follow the law, the data, and the committee's best judgment, even under public criticism.
Just jump into this, because in your testimony you talked about the Federal Reserve's, and I quote, rightful independence in the conduct of monetary policy, which is good. Now, as the Chairman Hill has indicated, I also do some foreign affairs work, and I'm very concerned about what's taking place in the Strait of Hormuz and rising cost of gas, because we know that when those prices go up at the pump, it gives higher transportation and energy cost, and they work their way through the economy, generally making groceries higher and household goods, et cetera. So it depends upon handling it. So if the administration's handling of the conflict with Iran contributes to another inflationary shock, will you make the decision you believe is in the best interest of the American people and the American economy in that rightful independent stance?
Congressman, that is always our commitment, to make the best decision we can, consistent with the remit and our understanding of the world. And as I said to the chairman at the outset, we'll deliver price stability.
So, and that's, still based upon what we've seen from the president thus far. Now, I just want to be clear, make sure that, because I got to be clear on this, that if the president publicly pressures you to pursue a different course than the one you believe is in the economic, that you believe the economic data supports, will you follow the president's wishes or follow the data?
My commitment to you is to follow the law and follow the data, follow our very best judgment.
And that's even if he publicly criticizes you for doing it. If you decide this is the way to go, this is what the data shows, and he publicly criticizes you and tells you how disappointed he's in you and all of that, will you still do what the data tells you to do?
I will, Congressman.
You ready for that?
I'm ready to follow the law, and I'm ready for the Fed to deliver on the expansive remit that you gave us. I'll make only one other note. We have a wide lens. We're interested in what's happening in the war. We're interested in what's happening in military conflicts around. We have to take that all in, but then we have to shut the door and make our very best decision. That's what we're going to do in a couple of weeks, and that's what we'll do in the remainder of my tenure.
Taken together, the hearing did not prove that the White House controls the Fed, and it did not prove that promises alone can protect independence. It showed a new chair making 3 commitments: 2% inflation, institutional reform, and decisions based on law and data. Critics can ask whether those commitments will survive a real confrontation. Supporters can point to Warsh's repeated refusal to accept a political chain of command. The final exchange comes from a Republican, framing independence as a national asset, not a partisan shield. The real test will be the next difficult vote, when economic evidence and presidential preference diverge. Subscribe for more hearing breakdowns. And tell me, would Warsh actually defy Trump?
Chairman Warsh, I'd like to begin by emphasizing the importance of the independence of the Federal Reserve. Markets rely on our financial system and the dollar as a stable, safe place to put their money. The stability of our financial system is at the center of our global influence. Our adversaries know that if they can break our debt markets, if they can break the dollar, they can remove one of the largest and most significant advantages we have as Americans. The strength of our system and, in turn, our ability to stand up against foreign adversaries that seek to destabilize it is partially a function of having an independent Federal Reserve. If we lose an independent Federal Reserve, we will lose the confidence of people around the world that use the U.S. markets and the U.S. dollar as a safe haven, and that would be devastating for our economy and the economic security alike. Thank you for your work. I want you to know that I strongly support your ability to operate in an independent fashion. And to that end, Mr. Chairman, before I get into the rest of my questions, I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak on the importance of an independent Federal Reserve.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm happy to do it. The Fed will remain independent on my watch. Fed independence is essential to the proper conduct of monetary policy, and I expect and will ensure that monetary policy is independent over the 4 years of my term. And like you, I think it provides extraordinary benefits in everything we do and strengthens the role of the United States and the U.S. dollar in the global economy.